He's the regional principal officer of the African Development Bank, and he is an Eisenhower fellow. Many of you here, many of us will understand what that means. These are rare, Africans, particularly from Sub-Saharan Africa, who's been put together and by a program. Okay, and most times they spend like 3 or 4 weeks, I think, in the US, crafting strategy, looking at how to, to help Africa. So it's actually a rare privilege to be an Eisenhower fellow. Dr. Somorin has had over 2 decades of, experience, and particularly with the African Development Bank. He's, at the time, the climate policy officer. He was also at some time the senior policy officer at the regional residence coordinator. Like I said, one of the 25 dynamics doers from across Sub-Saharan Africa who's working to address challenges of global warming. And they were put together sometime in the year 2022, if I'm correct. Doctor will clarify for that. Don't let me waste your time. We want to hear from him. And tonight, he'll be talking to us about climate change actions and the financing opportunities for Africa. Dr. Somorin, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Adaju. It's such an honor to be here and such an honor to be invited to speak to this group of eminent personalities. I feel truly honored. I want to thank God for this opportunity. I think it means a lot to me. But also I want to especially thank my friend of many years, more than 20 years, Engineer Seun Oluwalade. Thank you. I have to say that I didn't have an idea of the members of this group, but just looking at the names now, I want to be given the form to register, and I would definitely want to be part of this group. And I think you represent, and all of you represent, a movement of true leadership. And I like the fact that you focus on transformation. I would love to share my screen, and I'm hoping that that is possible. So please, can you see my screen? Okay, great. So yeah. I'm also very mindful of time, and I want this to be very conversational. I definitely want us to have enough time towards the end to be able to talk, ask questions, but also to share ideas. So again, my name is Olufunso Somorin. I'm with the African Development Bank. So I put on multiple hats. And the first is the fact that I work in a development institution that is very much at the center of development finance across the continent. And many of you may know this particular institution because our current president is a Nigerian and former Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, Dr. Adeshina. But also I put on an academic hat as well. So in the last few years, I have become a visiting professor in a number of schools. One is King's College in London, African Leadership University in Kigali, Rwanda, and University of Guelph in Canada. And I think if there are 3 key words that define the work that I do, the passion that I have, but also what I want to be identified with going forward, those keywords are leadership, development, and entrepreneurship. And if I may add another one, Africa, I am unapologetically Africa. And I think my conversation today will be very much about climate change, something that is changing in our continent, and that change is impacting us on a daily basis, but also how do we respond to it? So today, the conversation is Africa in a changing climate, realities, actions, and financing. And I'm going to be focusing more on the financing part, but we can reflect on more. And thank you for the introduction. Indeed, I'm an Eisenhower Fellow. And I have to say that this is just a fellowship that has really helped my journey as a young African, well, not so young anymore. But I also want to encourage anyone out there, please, if this is something, read about them. If you have an opportunity to join the fellowship, you will never regret it. So today, I think we can talk about a bit of a reminder. So I'm not going to, this is not one of my teaching classes, so I'm not teaching anything today, but what I want to do is to ignite a thought process. I want to ignite the fire of thinking, and I want us to ask questions on responsibilities, but also I want us to ask questions on opportunities. So to keep those two things in mind, responsibility and opportunity. And the bridge that connects both of them together is leadership. So I want us to look at climate change impact. What are those frameworks for financing actions on the ground? But what is the place of leadership in this climate action, particularly on the continent? And some of the innovations that we're playing with, but also to see where the opportunities are. We've learned a lot over the years, but more importantly, we can reflect and have some concluding remarks about going forward. So let me start by sharing a slide that many of you may have seen. And in fact, it's been updated, but I wanted to share this particular one for 2020. It's a global risk report, and I think it's a risk report that cuts across multiple layers of risk. And many people tend to be very interested in this report, which is produced by the World Economic Forum every year. And I need to tell you the database or the methodology behind this risk report. It's largely sending questionnaire, a survey, to most of the powerful business leaders and most of the top global leaders across multiple and different spheres of life, and to ask them a simple question or a set of questions, but to get a simple answer. On the scale of likelihood of occurrence and the severity of impact, what do they consider to be the biggest risk facing their business? On the severity of impact, you know, and there's an index for that, but also on the you know, possibility of the likelihood of occurrence. And what is important is all of them, from energy price shock to state collapse, to fragile, to war, to global governance failure, all of them have been mentioned, data fraud, cybersecurity, but there is a cluster of risk that are considered to be extremely high in likelihood of occurrence and at the same time in the severity of impact. And if you group them together, at top of the list is climate action failure, biodiversity loss, natural disaster, extreme weather. Now, I want you to put a perspective to this because I've been privileged to study climate change and to do climate change for many years. So if you came to me with this survey, it would have been easy for me to tell you climate change is the number one risk that the whole, you know, global systems face. But these are people who don't use the word climate change on a daily basis. These are people who are private sector, civil society, teachers, education and technologies, and all of them. And yet they were able to still refer to this. And it tells you a lot about what we're dealing with. That even when we don't call it climate change on a daily basis, there's a globally shared norm or shared perception that the group of risks that we face going forward are the risks that are really related to the climatic conditions of our ecosystem, of our natural habitat. And if you put it in perspective, I think it was in 2018, but also lately, it was the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who said the defining issue of our time is climate change. And we are at the defining moment. So humanity is at the defining moment because it's dealing with an issue that is a defining issue of our time. And I think it's very important because we're in a race to respond, whether in adapting or mitigating it, and we'll get there. And I wanted to show you this because you must also understand that why it's happening. There's a causality in terms of cause and effect when it comes to climate change. So first and foremost, there is a global distribution of emissions. So climate change is caused, and thank you, moderator, the chair, for explaining what it is. Basically, carbon that we emit from our industrial processes, from our consumption, from our production system, from our transport system, everything, when they get into the atmosphere, they change the climatic system and they cause an impact for us. So the global emission distribution globally shows a picture that is completely an inverse when it comes to global climate vulnerability. So basically, the region that is least responsible is the region that is most impacted. And that is where the conversation about climate justice comes into play, because you're talking about a continent that currently has 17% of total global population, yet is responsible for 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. And that it's quite significant, because the reverse of that is that when it comes to the regions that are most impacted by the problem of climate change, in fact, 8 out of 10 most climate vulnerable countries are in Africa. And I think the cost for us is even higher than other regions, because despite our limited development, we've documented over the years at the African Development Bank to show that up to 15% of GDP of some African countries is what they're losing to climate change, to the impact of climate change. And that is very significant for a country or for a region that is at the low base of development, that is struggling to get out, and yet is paying the highest for a problem that it did not cause. And I think we must keep that in mind, because the conversation about finance is also a conversation about justice. And it's also a conversation about how we frame the problem. And look, if you don't even trust the African economic outlook to say, look, you guys are Africa, we don't know your data, I wouldn't even argue with you. And we said, let's trust probably the Economic Intelligence Unit. And they're a bit they're a bit conservative. But one thing is very important, I want you to look at it. The average GDP loss annually by 2050, on average, by 2050, yet the same, the region that is least responsible for the problem is the region that's going to be most affected by it. And there's an economic, and we can quantify that loss. We can quantify it. And I'll give you an example. We have a continent that has a total GDP of $3.1 trillion, $3.1 trillion. If 10% of that is lost to climate change, that is a lot of money that could have gone into development, that could have gone into education. Because 10% of $3 trillion is $300 billion. And think of that annually in terms of the impact on the ground. And the biggest risk to Africa's development, as mentioned by a lot of private sector, it's climate change. So that's the scale of problem we're dealing with. I wanted to share with you a few pictures, and these are all pictures from Nigeria. And given that we're talking about our own country here, and look, and this is a very complex thing about climate change, because in most countries, including Nigeria, climate change is relatively a water crisis. If it rains too much, it leads to flooding. If it doesn't rain at all for a long period of time, it leads to drought. And we found cases where we have experienced both drought and flooding in the same country, in different parts of the country. And these are extremes of weather condition when it comes to climate and water. And some scientists have tried to do what they call vulnerability map of Nigeria. And it's really funny, because the map says that both Lagos State and FCT are the two states in the whole country that are extremely low vulnerable to climate change. And I saw that, and I really laughed, because it tells you that if Lagos has the lowest vulnerability, then you don't want to imagine what Yobe is like. And that just really tells you about the extreme nature of this impact, but constantly the economic and social costs in terms of life lost, property destroyed, and it's not something that is happening once in a while. We are having cases where the occurrence and the frequencies are so rapid to the point that you have limited time to recover from one risk or one hazard, one impact, before you face another one. And that undermines your ability and your capacity to respond. And in Nigeria, and I think we have got rough data about what is the cost of climate change to the Nigerian economy. But look, I also want you to understand, if we can't make sense of these, probably we can make sense of the fact that we're dealing with the impacts of things we're experiencing now. But unfortunately, the future is not even looking better. And in fact, the future is looking worse, because as we experience a relative increase in global temperature averages compared to the previous level of 1999, like a century ago, the future scenarios are really, really disturbing. And let me put it in a perspective for you. A child that was born in 2000, if that child lives up to 70 years, as an average life expectancy of that child, so that child is expected to make it to 2090. That child, by the time that child becomes an adult and a grandparent, by 2090, not 2000, 2090, by 2090, at 70 years of age, that child would have been exposed to the impact, the risk, the exposure of climate change much more than the grandfather of that child. And I'm going to pause here because I want you to understand that unfortunately it's not going to get better. And this is where actions are very important, because a child born today, and you can look at this graph that gives you a sense of that. By 2023, that child is 3 years old. By the time that child is 70, or that individual is 70, by 2090, the exposure to all kinds of risk that that person will be facing in their lifetime, it's worse than what their own grandparents faced. And you're going to ask yourself, even though we've achieved a significant level of development, even though we have achieved a significant level of education, and standard of living is relatively better compared to our grandparents, but the future scenarios, and this is a UN as a group of scientists, what we call IPCC, have just released it. This came out barely 2 months ago. And then they said, we are not just at the defining moment, we have to do things. Unfortunately, we have our house on fire. And so Africa, if your house is on fire, the question is, what are you going to do while you're waiting for the fireman to come? And especially in a case that you don't know how long it's going to take the fireman to get to you. And that is the reality on the ground. And for some of us who are parents and who are looking forward to seeing our grandchildren, it's important to understand the scenarios that they're going to live in. And you need to also understand that even if they are not directly exposed to higher temperature, think of what higher changes in climatic system would have impact on pandemics, and food insecurity issues, and because of agriculture is impacted, it affects our food security. So, and I think it's very important to understand what we're dealing with, because what we've dealt with, I live here in Nairobi, and I forgot to mention, and it's 11 p.m. here. And it's interesting because this region, from one drought to another, in fact, every drought now has a label, has a record of the worst drought in the history of the country. And we're having that on every 2 years. And it's unfortunate that even the animals that survived the drought, the moment the drought ended, the rain came, they died in flooding. And that is, and we are talking of pastoral communities, and the same in northern Nigeria, where their livelihood systems depend on those livestock that form safety net for them. And I think it's very important for us to be able to understand what this means. So at the global level, what options have we got? Basically, we've got two options. One option is avoid the problem by mitigating. We must do things, and we must do them quickly, that help us to reduce emissions. How do we reduce emission? Minimize emission release. So the activities that are causing high emissions, minimize them if you can't completely stop them. And you hear a lot of things about coal, because coal and the industrial age really was actually probably the biggest contributor of emissions in the atmosphere. We can also look at new technologies, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and the likes. We have to mitigate the problem. And you hear a lot of those things. Also using nature, because if you plant a tree, and the tree absorbs carbon in the atmosphere. So if you're not releasing carbon into the atmosphere, you must also invest in things that can remove carbon from our atmosphere. So whether it's, and that's why we call avoidance, carbon emission avoidance, or carbon removal. And these are things that are very important for mitigation. That's a part of the story. But you know one thing, unfortunately, we're locked in a system where whatever mitigation ambition we have today, the very best of it, it will take probably 30 years for it to take effect. And for some of you who've got, geography or physics, you probably might know this, or atmospheric chemistry. And so basically it means that we have a lag time of about 20 to 30 years, where even the best of our mitigation will not solve the problem immediately. We need to adapt. And that's where adaptation comes in, because adaptation deals with the actions that help us to manage the impact. You manage the impact. And that is a number of things. Some of them we're already doing them, but some of them we need to do more. And we need a combination of both adaptation and mitigation in order to be able to keep humanity together, in order to be able to survive. But we need to be very ambitious with mitigation. So there's a legal framework for this, that we all have responsibility, no matter who you are. Even the same continent that contributed barely 3%, and yet is the most affected, still has a responsibility. And that is very much nested within the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And everything, and I'm sure every one of you, by November, December, you're going to hear all in the media, COP, climate change conference, we're going to this country, this year is in Dubai, and all of that. And all of the global negotiation, it's about that. Remember I told you at the beginning, keep in mind two things, responsibility, opportunity. And so the principle, the global principles around climate change is what we call CDR, common but differentiated responsibility. It means we all have a common responsibility towards our humanity, to the survival of our humanity, but we recognize that those responsibilities must be differentiated based on our capabilities, based on our development level, but also based on the cause of the problem. And so when you hear, and I was trying to be funny here by putting that, so developed nations, a group of them will say, we must all do something. And when we say we mean you. They were telling the developing countries, and you can see the frown face of like, really? What do you mean by that? But that's the story. And when you hear all of these fights, all of these, we couldn't reach an agreement. And that is because those who cause the problem are shifting responsibilities, and they're locating blame as well. And they are coming up with new metrics to not hold themselves legally responsible for that. But that's the legal framework. And it comes down to how we deal with the policies at the global level. But now let's get into finance, because like I said, it's a bit of a justice conversation, but we must understand what is happening. First and foremost, we've been able to do something to aggregate at the global level. How much cost? What is the cost of responding to climate change? to the level that is needed on an annual basis. And we came up with a range, and this is a global, I mean, you would have seen this everywhere for those who are involved in this. The range is $1.6 trillion, 1.6 to $3.8 trillion on an annual basis of investment, particularly on mitigation, in order to achieve a temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. If we don't reach 1.5 degrees, we go above it, 2.0, 2.5. The higher we go, the more dire the consequences are. And again, don't forget, even when globally everybody is affected by climate change, some countries have the capacity to adapt. The ones that don't have the capacities are in Africa. And so if we don't achieve this goal, we're going to be most impacted. So that is the cost of it. On an average, that it costs about $1.6 to $3.8 trillion. Now, when we map all the resources that have been available to climate change globally, and I think that number is a little bit more now. So it's about $700 billion annually. And forgive me, I'm going to be mentioning big names, but you're going to understand that we're solving a big problem, but also the opportunities are really huge as well. It's about 700, anything between 600 to $700 billion. So you can see the steady growth year in, year out, and it's really small, I'll say. But despite the year-to-year growth in the global climate finance, it's nothing compared to even the base of the range that we've set for ourselves. And we have mapped globally. We've been able to map where the money is coming from and where it's going. So there's a huge gap, and I think that's the first point here, between the demand and supply of climate finance. And I've been privileged to write a lot on climate change and climate finance across, and I think, and I'll come back to speak about this demand and supply crisis when it comes to climate finance. Now, this is where we are. So remember, I told you, in fact, the 1.6 to 3.8 billion was estimated for 2020 to 2030. By the time we get to, if we're going to model it across to 2050, we're talking about $6 trillion annually of investment. And I don't want to scare you, because you hear this $1 trillion, you start asking yourself, is that really possible? Is that something that we can afford? We're going to come down to that. So we need to make a major shift, and or probably a major jump. And that's what the dotted line on this graph is showing. So to be able to catch up with the goal. And I think that is why finance is the most complex conversation in all the global negotiations, because we talk about, in 2009, there was a promise of $100 billion every year. That is even nothing. And even that was not even achieved, let alone now that the cost has gone higher. And I want you to look at that dotted line, because that is what we're trying to do. Most of the innovations in the world of climate finance is to achieve that dotted line and be able to make the resources available for us to be able to do this, because we have to do it. We have to do it. We cannot afford the picture I showed you about the generationality of climate change, where the children born today or born in 3 years ago will deal with all form of crisis for the rest of their life. So I'm trying to ask a question here, because we have about, I told you, anything between 600 to $700 billion that we spent, but what we're still missing is close to $3 trillion annually. And what we have is just a fraction of what is needed. And I'm wondering, and I'm asking a question, and probably you're also asking the same question, that why are climate policies, actions, and programs not receiving adequate finance? if this is such a big problem of that kind of scale that we've described, if this is something that could define the ability of a country to even provide basic services to its citizen, if this climate change has an ability to undo years of development, not just impede your ability to develop going forward, to even make sure that the development you've achieved up to now, no matter how small it is, it can undo it. How is it that at the global level, and perhaps at the national level, we cannot allocate the necessary resources for it? Is it because we don't have the money for it? And that's a question that I want us to pause for a moment to ask. Is it that these trillions are just too much, that we cannot afford it, and there's nothing we can do? You would think so, but the answer is absolutely not true. Because let me give you some sense of it. The question is, how big is the climate fight? And someone said, not as big as the 5 industries. The oil and gas today, the oil and gas industry today, as we speak, is $4.6 trillion. And if you can't make sense of that, the e-commerce industry, as we speak today, is $9 trillion. The construction industry globally, as we speak today, is $12.5 trillion. Remember, we're talking about, there's a shortfall about just $3 trillion. And yet there are industries that are worth a lot more. If you want to understand something, I did it, and I was very curious about this, and I tried to look for the data to put this together. The top 100 banks, commercial banks, globally, they manage a balance sheet. They manage a balance sheet of about $120 trillion. I want you to pause for a moment to understand that the top 100 banks globally, in terms of probably what they manage in assets, or probably the volume of the business that they do, and that is almost 1.2 trillion on average, each one of them, and we know where they are, from US to China, and basically all developed countries. It will also interest you to know that private asset managers, the Vanguard, the BlackRock of this world, what they hold in financial assets is $210 trillion. That is twice the global GDP. So, and I want to, and you see, these may be numbers, and perhaps it doesn't make sense. It's just numbers. I want us to pause for a moment to reflect on 2 key points. Number one, money is not necessarily scarce. The quantum of money that we need to achieve the level of development that we want globally, that quantum of money currently exists in the global financial system. We don't need to wait to do trade, make profit before we do things. We don't need to print money. We're talking about what the quantum of resources that we need currently exists in the global financial system. That's the first point. The second point is that the biggest challenge is distribution. It's a distribution challenge, because whilst you talk about abundance of capital in one part of the world, there is an absolute less of it in another part of the world. There's a country called Norway. Norway has a population of 5.4 million people. In fact, the real Norwegians are about 4.7 million people. Let's give it to them, 5.4 million people. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund of $1.4 trillion. 5.4 million people with a sovereign wealth fund of $1.4 trillion. Actually, in fact, the latest figure is 1.5. And I want you to understand what a sovereign wealth fund is. It's not your annual budget. It's the money that you've set aside just to do business for the future generation. And you're not going to go to Norway as an African country to say, look, we're dealing with climate change, come and help us. because the global order, when it comes to trade and finance, responds to partnership of trade as opposed to helping somebody. Even when you know that the problem that they are in, you put them in there, is still not a basis to help them. So rather, you can do business with them. And we're going to come to that because it's very important to shift our mind away from these I'm vulnerable, I didn't cause a problem. We've been saying this forever, it's not helping us. And we must understand the language and the business of money, particularly within the climate era. And the third point I want to mention within link today is we need to creatively think about a way where we can solve this demand and supply crisis by thinking about frameworks that help us to move money from where it is most abundant, perhaps less needed, to where it is most needed and less abundant. And I want to repeat that for a moment because it's almost about a 2x2 matrix. It's abundance versus need. Can we move money from where it is most abundant and perhaps less needed? Because if somebody is putting $1.5 trillion for the generation unseen, then it means they don't need it now. Can we move money from where it is most abundant, less needed, to where it is most needed but less abundant? And the innovations that we see and that I imagine in the world of today is solving that problem. It's creating that facilitative mechanism or modalities to move the money from where it exists to where it is most needed. And I think this is the approach that we will need to climate change. But the question we should ask ourselves is, why has that not happened? Because this is not a rocket science, you know. In fact, if there's any region of the world that has the biggest opportunity for mitigation, even though mitigation is not our biggest priority in Africa, it's still there, Africa. Because as we speak today, only 17% of the infrastructure that is needed for us to reach a developed status is currently in existence in Africa. And I want to repeat that because we basically have a 3% gap to follow and an opportunity to follow a development pathway that is not carbon intensive. But there has to be somebody who's going to pay for that. So only 17% of the infrastructure that we need to reach a relative developed status is currently in existence. There's a 3% gap. So if you're going to compare Burundi to Sweden, when it comes to infrastructure, there's a massive gap. However, can we finance a pathway that Burundi would take or Nigeria would take that is not the same pathway that Sweden or America took together? And that is also where we need to use our unfortunate realities to build a bunch of actions that can direct us in the that can move us in the direction of where the capital is. And the missing link there is climate change. It's leadership, not climate change. And I want to speak a little bit about that. Now, it will interest you to know that we have very active leaders in Africa who are attending global meetings. And I'm not saying this, to mock them, but I think the conversation that they have pushed for the longest was the conversation of pointing an accusing finger, and it never helped them because it just never helped them at all. And now we're seeing we're beginning to see an emergence of new leaders who are leading new and bold conversations on climate actions. And it's not just about we are vulnerable, we didn't cause a problem, because that's what we've said for the last almost 30 years. But it's now a conversation about, look, we need to adapt. We're already spending our money to adapt. Can you partner with us? Or there's an opportunity for you to do mitigation in our country because we have large expanse of land that can be afforested. And we even have pristine forests in the Central African region, Congo Basin, that we haven't touched. So you can compensate us for us to keep them. And these are some of these conversations that are happening. Are they happening at the level and the scale that they should be happening at? Probably not. But can they get better? Absolutely, yes. But our leadership is very critical. And it's not just a leadership about coming to global conferences and talking about them. No, it's a leadership about mechanizing operational frameworks and leading by examples in the country. Some countries are doing very well. I'm proud to raise my hand to say Rwanda any day, and to see how Rwanda has been able to repackage itself. And today we're talking of hundreds of millions of dollars in climate finance going to Rwanda. Look, it's not a leadership that is state-centric. It doesn't start and end with the leadership in terms of the president, heads of state going for meetings. It's also a leadership that cuts across every sphere of the stakeholder group, you know, from civil society organization to youth organization. Our research institutions have got a lot to do. Religious groups, local communities, union, trade unions, farmers union. And look, even this conversation we are having today, it is part of our leadership as a group in order to be able to talk about it, but also not just talk about it, but also to see what are the entry points for solving it. I like this slide because this is my boss, a man that I dearly love and respect, and who has paved the way for a lot of us. And I think his approach and the approach that he takes, it's really simple. It is fund. We need a lot to tackle climate change. We need finance. And I think some of the boldest and biggest programs, in fact, the biggest adaptation program in Africa right now has been developed by African Development Bank. And it's $25 billion in 5 years. And that's an average of $5 billion that we are doing and mobilizing capital across in order to use our resources to mobilize other capital and be able to deploy them into projects and programs that have very, very positive impact on the ground. I'm very mindful of time. So today I want to talk to you about some of the innovations and opportunities. And look, I'm going to be the first to admit that it's possible that you may not relate to all of them immediately at the moment, but as you move on, you know, in the journey of the work and your leadership role at different levels, some of these points may come into you later, but it's good to reflect on them in terms of what are those current innovations. So one of the things we've done at the bank, and I didn't want to make this conversation about AFDB, I really wanted to speak about my own idea of what is happening and what we should be doing differently. But it's important to recognize that within the bank, we've created something called African Financial Alliance on Climate Change. And I'll tell you, it doesnn't have to be owned by AFDB, but the value of this alliance is basically to say, look, in order for us to unlock opportunities for our countries, we need multiple hands knocking on multiple doors at the same time. And I'm going to say that. We need multiple hands knocking on multiple doors of opportunity at the same time. But you're not going to know those doors of opportunity if you don't yourself know what are the opportunities that are in climate change. Because climate change offers transfer of wealth, transfer of capital. It offers an incentive to go a particular pathway that's different from the one we are all condemning. And so what we've done is to build a strong alliance of banks, central banks, commercial banks, and all of that in order for them to understand what this means, but also to see how they can use it and how it can probably impact their businesses and take advantage of it and make capital available. So if they are able to access global capital, they can deploy that capital. So if somebody says, I have a proposal and it's on climate smart agriculture, because of that climate component, that person should be able to get a climate finance from even a commercial bank at a pricing that is way lower than if the person just had another type of project. So that is where we're getting into. The more you bring a lot of people into it, we train them, we exchange ideas, we help them develop strategies, we share tools and methodologies with them, and then we help them to knock on doors and unlock the kind of partnership can do that. Because you can't have one institution doing that. We're 1.3 billion people. By 2050, we're going to be 2.5 billion people. we need multiple hands knocking on multiple doors in order to unlock that scale of opportunity that we need. Because in Africa, please keep two things in mind: speed and scale. We must do big things within a short period of time. And that is very important. And one of the ways of doing that is to create this partnership, this alliance, and it's really kicking off, taking shape. And currently we do have close to 1,000 members in the alliance. And some of them are there, some of them are still struggling, but we hope that they will get there at some point. The second thing is to also understand that, and I hate to say this, and probably some of you may agree with me, I think as a continent, we haven't understood the law of money. We probably haven't understood how the global financial system works compared to the rest of the world. We have not really perfected our art of doing business. And it's quite a shame, because we have the opportunity to do business. We have the things that could give us an edge in the marketplace, but we haven't understood them. We haven't used them well. And so we find ourselves always trying to catch up. By the time you're coming to a new space, others, particularly Asian, they've taken over and they've finished everything. Whatever remains, that's what we're trying to grapple with. And you know, and it's quite shameful, but that's the truth. And we need to change that. And one of the ways we can change that is to understand smart investment. You will never have all the money that you need at once, but you must always know, how do you use what you have in a very smart way to get what you want. I don't believe in, if you've got a project, the total 100% of the project should be financed by a development bank. No, we should use development banks' money, because they are mostly grant or extremely concessional loans, to leverage either public capital, like government, either national level or state level, for instance, in Nigeria, and also combine both together to de-risk by crowding in private capital. So you always, I've had the privilege to live in Europe for a few years, and I can tell you that there is always this blended finance at its finest. And I think it's going to be very important that some of the investment that we have to do that are going to achieve our climate goals, they are going to be investment that will require us to think out of the box, to see how do we optimize and combine our financial instruments or different instruments at different times in order to be able to achieve the goal. It's really important. I'm going to rush through. It's okay. I think we've got 30 minutes to go. This slide will be available. I'll be happy to share with that. You can reflect on them. So we've got examples of blended finance and how do we do them. Now, I want to focus a little bit on something. Remember, this conversation around there is about innovations as well and opportunities. Something is emerging, and it's emerging, and it's really growing big, and it's growing big very fast. And it's a second wave. It's carbon finance, as we call it, or carbon market opportunities. And we're in the second wave of it. Unfortunately, the first wave came. By the time, and that was the days, and many of you may have heard about Clean Development Mechanism, the days of CDM. By the time we woke up to understand this thing that they're calling CDM, what is it? And it was very interesting that I think it was in the last 2 years of CDM that some African projects managed to go through. And barely after that, CDM died. So we've left the Kyoto Protocol under the climate change. We're now in the Paris Agreement, and we are in this. And right now, this one is being built. We've learned a lot of lessons from the first wave, and the second wave is better. And we have an enormous opportunity to be part of it, but you will need to think out of the box. And basically, what is it? You know, a private company or a country emits, and in order to achieve its carbon mitigation goals, it's going to ask itself a question: can I do that internally? If the answer is yes, would it impact my business? If the answer is no, then it does that internally. But if he asks himself, can I do that? Can I reduce my emission? And he says, look, I'm going to be honest, I cannot reduce it. Or the cost of reducing it is too high because I'm already locked in a system that makes it harder to reduce. But however, I'm willing to pay for someone else who can do it offsite. And that is carbon. So basically, this company pays for sequestration and you generate credit and that. Now, it's not as simple as what, I mean, it's that simple logically in terms of principle, but obviously there are a lot of levels involved. And when you think about the type of credit that are most in demand, because right now the carbon market is supply constrained. So we have more demand for credit than we are currently supplying. And I think it's very important to understand that some of these solutions are linked to our development work. Look, if you put on a solar panel at large scale or medium scale or small scale, the initial benefit of that is for you to have energy access. And perhaps at a low pricing. What if you can just go through a bit of a methodology and have a third person to verify that and quantify the carbon emissions that you generate by having those solar panels, and you sell that in the market, and you're getting an additional revenue? That is the world that we're moving into. We're not even moving there, we're already in there. That is the world we are in right now. And there are few people who have understood this and they're taking advantage of it. And we need to talk about seeing this as an opportunity. So let me give you a sense of it. As we speak today, so there's a compliance market, which is about $1 trillion. There is a voluntary market. So voluntary market is where private companies who have decided, look, we want to have net zero. And I'm sure you would have heard this thing called net zero, net zero. Private companies who are doing that, they go through the voluntary carbon market because their board has pushed them to do that. It's part of their new ESG strategy and the likes. But companies in developed countries are operating within compliance market. And under Paris Agreement, it's possible for a country like Switzerland, and right now, Switzerland has a partnership with Ghana, where for Switzerland to reach its goal, it's realized that even if the companies in Switzerland if all of them reduce their emission, Switzerland will still not meet its goal. So Switzerland is having emission reductions in Ghana, and it's paying the government of Ghana. Today, Norway pays Gabon $150 million every year. For what? Don't destroy the forest. Get in there, doing that. You can cut trees, just make sure the carbon balance remains intact. I mean, I don't think Gabon will wake up one day, a very tiny country, 89% land mass, totally forested, by barely 1.2 million people, and decide to cut everything down. We're talking about that incentive structure that says, look, I can be part of your solution, but you have to pay me. And you need to do that. You can do that state level. But if you say, no, I mean, we can't do that in Nigeria, private companies can do that. And that is the value of the carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market, where all of us listening here may be able to play in, is growing at an enormous rate. In fact, it's going to grow 15 times by 2030, and it's going to grow 100 times by 2050. And McKinsey does a lot of work around analyzing that. And if we manage to push the price of carbon higher, we could be talking about billions of dollars worth of transactions. And do you know the funniest thing? And this is the best kept secret. The market is very assorted. It can tell you the type of carbon it's looking for. It can say, look, I want, somebody can come in and say, I want carbon that has to do with nature solutions, good agricultural system. And today, Netflix carbon zero emission targets are supported in the voluntary carbon market, supplied by credits in Kenya. And we're going to get into that. So that is something that is happening, and it's a new way. And what are we doing with all of this? We are trying to move money, keep in mind, from where it is most abundant and less needed to where it is most needed and less abundant. We're not begging for it. We're creating business and we're creating value in a way. And this is what I'm talking about. About a whole region is just doing rangeland management. You do that for yourself. You do that because you need to do that. But imagine that they quantify the carbon, 50 million tons of carbon, and Netflix in California was interested in that. That is the type of conversation that we're talking about. I want to conclude here because I know we and I don't want to keep you longer. Thanks a lot for your patience. Well, the first point and the thought I want to put out there is the fact that this change, I think we're still underestimating the impact of it on us. You may say it's unfair, and I agree with you, but we don't have the luxury of complaining, of sitting down mourning and complaining. We have to do something, and it's very urgent. Number two, there's power in framing. I did a PhD on the framing in political discourses with regards to climate change and development. And think about it. If you frame something as a cost, your approach to it is different from if you frame that same thing as an investment. Even though at the end of the day, you're spending money. How we frame things, how we frame issues in life, they determine, or to a large extent, what value we allocate to them and how we allocate value to them. It's the same thing somebody can frame as a problem, another person can frame it as an opportunity. And the way they embrace it as an opportunity is different from the way they embrace it as a problem. Can it be both a problem and opportunity? Absolutely, yes. But you're able to manage it when it comes to the crisis side of it, but you're able to maximize the opportunity side of it. And that is what climate change offers us. We cannot continue to frame it as it's affecting us, the cost is high. We have to start framing it as an opportunity and to be very inclined and see how do we ignite our system and engineer new ways of maximizing that opportunity. The third point I want to mention is the fact that when it comes to finance, we're always going to have a question that is going to keep beckoning on us, and that is, should we finance change or should we change finance? And I think through my very good friend, Sean, I've written a lot about this thing of financing change or changing finance, and I'll be able to share that. Because basically what we're talking about is how do we understand this demand and supply side of capital? And how do we build innovations? Because it's not a question of inadequacy. It's absolutely not a question. It's a question of lack of innovation. We haven't innovatively embraced the conversation because we're still embracing it from the part of adequate. Is it there or not? Because the people are telling you it's not there, but then the same people know that it is there. Money is not a problem. And please always keep that in mind. Money is not necessarily scarce. It is just unevenly distributed. And the moment we know that, then the next thing is, how do we tap into where it is abundant? Particularly given the fact that we are the ones who need it most. I'm going to conclude here. Whatever you call it, climate change, climate action, climate response, adaptation, mitigation, I'll tell you something, it is development. This is the core of our development, because in Africa, everything is linked to climate change. We run economies that are dependent on sectors that are climate impacted. You can actually put an economic value on a delayed rain for a week. You can actually put societal value of drought. It is very important, and the approaches that we must build must be multidisciplinary, and we may do that. The last point, leadership is about taking responsibility. I would love to see, and when we see the fight that some of us are fighting at the global scene with everything that we have, is that we help our own people on the one hand to shift from that mindset of being helped to being a partner. And then when we go out to the global scene, then we tell the other people on the other side is don't see us as victims, see us as partners. And I think it's very important that that shift happens, and it happens quickly, because we must be able to be a partner. It's a business, it's a game. And in this game, there are rules of the game. And you have to be part of those who design the rules of the game as well. And everything you do must be part of it. And so climate change is not just the fact that the rain has not rained or the weather has not weathered. No, climate change is at the very core of the transformation we want to achieve. And it's at the very core of how we see ourselves going forward. And I'm hoping all of you here are going to be part of that journey. I want to say a very big thank you. I'll keep it there for now. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chair.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Somorin. This has been, very, very exciting. I mean, for me, it's like going back to, to class again. I want to say, everyone, please just get your question and your comments ready. And if you want to intervene electronically, raise your hands, and then you'll be recognized. In the next 10, 12 minutes, it's about 10 minutes, we'll quickly take some questions and some comments. So please, if you want to jump in, let me know, raise your hand, and I'll call you. But while we're at it, there are some key punchy words that come to me tonight. One of them is that climate change is primarily a water issue, water problem. Is either you have too much of it, or you don't have, you have too little of it. Interesting. And of course, responses are both in mitigation and adaptation. I was going to also ask a doctor, maybe you should prepare for that. We've seen more money going to mitigation activities rather than adaptation. You might want to tell us why. The private sector, are they not finding adaptation programs commercially viable? These are some of those questions I get asked. And also, he talks about the Conference of Parties, COP. I mean, I was at the last COP in Egypt. It's always a very interesting. Anybody who wants to be in this space, you prepare to go to COP. It happens once a year, right? Yeah. Also, there was a report by the World Energy Outlook. Of course, we know that Africa emits averagely, say, about 10% of emission. Yet the most impact affects Africa. However, there was a report that was also done in 2022. Only about 1% of investments globally into climate change issues came to Africa, just less than 1%, which is also a challenge. I also want to know what can we do to reverse this, as a continent. I also have that the challenge is actually that of distribution. Okay, so you have very few people holding the bulk of the wealth, and majority, I mean, it's called the pyramid, right? And those are the base of the pyramid. They are much more higher than those are the peak. And then those are the peak holds huge part of these resources. Another word I'm taking home is speed and scale. So actually, I operate in the decentralized renewable energy space. I deploy part of an organization that deploys solar power for SMEs, small businesses, residential household. And yes, we're working with a partner also to let every one of us here know some of the opportunities that exist in the sector. So we're working with a partner who's registered what we call a program of activities, a POA, and carbon credit is being paid. So the products get to our customers, barber shops and the rest, at some very subsidized rate because of the carbon credit. So yeah, although the cost of registering for most companies in Africa seems to be very high, $180,000, $250,000 can scare many of us away, but we latch on POAs from other countries. Yes, Sheon, let me take your comments. Please, if you want to intervene, feel very free. Either you raise your hand or you just put your comment in the chat room. So from Engineer Sheung, there is a general conception that Africa cannot develop fast if it wants to be less carbon intensive. Yes, that's another argument. So we're saying there's a focus that Africa should transition, energy transition. Meanwhile, Africa has not developed, it has not built that industrial base that many developed countries have used coal, nuclear energy to develop. So there's this argument between Africa developing and Africa not, and Africa transiting. Meanwhile, Africa is not emitting as much as these developed countries. So maybe I should allow Dr. Somorin to take over from here and provide some clarity. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. I knew I was going to get into trouble with very difficult questions. So thank you for not sparing me. And I really love this conversation. And I think because we are asking the right questions. So let me start with you. See, to be honest, and I know we've been recorded, and I'm honest enough to admit, we're not. I think we also recognize that we're not going to be taken to any court of law if we increase our emissions. Now, and when you look at the long-term projections, it's actually that we will actually increase emissions up to a certain point to build the infrastructure that we need to industrialize, and then with time we're going to be reducing. But even then, today, on a per capita basis, even if we increase our emissions to 5%, we're talking about 3.6% now. Even if we increase it to 5%, global emissions by 2050. Remember that by that same 2050, we're going to be 2.5 billion people. So on per capita basis, it's still very marginal. It's still nothing. So there is room for us to actually increase our emission. But it's very important to also understand that there's an incentive that we can negotiate to have a shift, to follow a new pathway. Now, if that incentive is not on the table, then you don't have, as a matter of fact, you don't need to have a moral obligation to follow that pathway. It has to be financed. And so the just transition is only going to be a transition if it is just. And what is the just there? The justice is there has to be capital available. And look, I want to say this, other countries have been able to negotiate it. They are moving in that direction. So I think it's an opportunity for us, because at the end of the day, the primary goal of renewable energy is energy access. The secondary outcome is, it's a carbon mitigation or climate mitigation. The primary goal is energy access. We would probably be in a difficult situation if we are telling people to go green, if we don't have green endowments. We actually have abundance of green endowment, in terms of solar, wind, hydro, and we haven't explored them because we've not had resources to do that. Now we have an opportunity to come to the table to negotiate and say, we want to go this path, is green you want, we'll give you green, but you have to pay for it. Even if you're not paying for it free of cost for me, you have to give me a pricing arrangement that's below market rate in order for me to do it. And that is the advantage. And I'm probably putting in a layman term, but that is the advantage. Because at the end of the day, you only send carbon to them, and nobody sees carbon. We calculate it, but you keep the energy, and the energy is there for your growth. And the capital that you need to be able to do that scale of energy is unlocked to you by labeling it. So I always jokingly say, money has a new color, and it's green. And the moment you're able to plug into that conversation, you have the opportunity to be able to leapfrog your development. And that links to the question of, Can we develop without being carbon intensive? The answer is yes. Some of us moved from no phones, no landline, to mobile phones. And we didn't need to go through that. So you can actually move things at that speed that is needed. You don't have to go through step by step. And that has been, we've also seen it. When we eventually got phone, innovations came from nowhere. I live in Nairobi. You literally don't need cash in Kenya. Everything. And I think in Nigeria, you're almost getting that. And in some other places, you literally have everything on your phone, bills, everything. And so we have an opportunity to build that infrastructure. We can do it in a green way, as long as we're able to sell the idea that, look, we're achieving a multiple outcome. The energy that we need, but also the green or the carbon emissions that the world needs, and the world is willing to pay for that. And that leads to the question about the disparity between mitigation and adaptation finance. And it's quite unfortunate, because the truth about it is, if there's anything that's a priority for Africa, it is adaptation. Because mitigation is not our obligation. We can, in that common but differentiated principle, it is really not. But we're encouraged to do it. But if there's anything that we need, and that is adaptation. But adaptation is not very commercialized. It's not very commercialized. Most of the activities that you have to do within the adaptation space are activities that probably will not have the significant cash flow that will attract private investment. The investment in mitigation are largely driven by private sector, because they can get a power purchase agreement for 20 years, and they can pump a lot of money to get megawatts of electricity, green electric power. So it's really important to begin to see, and that's part of the work that we're doing within this largest adaptation program, the AFDB. How do we build the business case? How do we build the economic case for adaptation investment? How do I look at water and not just think of water as a basic human dignity, human right, but how do I think of water and think of it as a business commodity in a way that it doesn't undermine its fundamental human needs or human rights question? And I think it's very important that we're able to really think deep and explore new ideas, and probably, challenge some norms in order for that to happen. So we are working hard and to see, and look, forgive me if I have to keep using, Kenya is a good case now. So the government came and said, look, the way they have just created a structure and said, the way we encourage private sector investment in renewable energy and you get a PPA for a period of time, we're creating the same model for water. So government will now invest in water at a resource source level. They want private sector to do it. You supply to government, they pay for it. And you're even allowed to probably put a small hydro in there. If you can't sell to the government, you can also work with farmers to make sure that you provide that on the irrigation scheme, and you're part of the revenue sharing formula at the end. There are many things we can do. And it's important, and I always say this, don't even think of going to South Korea to see what they're doing. Just within Africa, for Nigeria, let's think about what we can learn from some of our African countries. Climate investment flows, 1%. It's very true, because, all right, so on average, what comes into Africa is $30 billion on climate finance. And it's nothing compared to what we need, but at least it's something. And it's largely public capital, while other regions have been able to attract huge quantum of private capital. We have not been able to do that in Africa. So it's really important that we are able to find a way to be able to bring this private capital to increase that share. And again, like I said, some of the innovations we have to do, we don't have to do rocket science. We just have to do good things in a good way or differently. So when we have blended finance, and I'm sure, Dr. Adaju, you don't know this, how we can de-risk. Private sector is driven by profitability. They're driven by risk management. What can we then use public capital to de-risk and be able to crowd in those private capital and be able to increase access. It's the same. I mean, in some parts, one of the biggest things that came out of my Eisenhower fellowship was I didn't realize that the philanthropic capital in the US is $1.1 trillion annually. And philanthropic capital is not loan. It's not any type of loan. It's pure grant. $1.1 trillion of philanthropic capital. And I was like, wow, can we find a way to bring that category of investors in the entire mix? Because most people, when you talk to them, it's basically government money, MDB money, or commercial investors. And there's a whole world of opportunity in capital market and the likes that we have to do. So I know we have 5 minutes to go. So let me keep it there. It's the beginning of a long conversation. It's not going to end here. But again, I'm going to submit my membership form. I want to be part of this group. And I'm hoping that we can learn more. But thank you. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Maybe just in a minute, with the permission of Engineer Shehu, I saw the chairman of the INT Nigeria Alumni Association raise his hands, Dr. Olufunso Somorin, and at the same time, I saw a comment by Marianne that says businesses are struggling to achieve profitability. Now is it commercially viable to channel our scarce funds into climate change agenda? But let me ask Dr. Somorin to please unmute and speak. Maybe that will be the last for tonight. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you so very much, Chairman. I actually put I put it down because I think Dr. Somorin has done a whole lot of justice to the things I wanted to ask. But all the same, since you're giving me the floor, I would want to say 2 things. Dr. Somorin, thank you so very much for a very, very illuminating paper. That was quite incisive and well researched. The 2 stuff I want to speak to, one of them is actually a need for clarification, and then the other one is an observation. Now, let me go straight to the clarification that I need. In your slide where you spoke to adaptation mitigation, those 2, the flocks you had there, you had right there in the middle something you call community, complete communities. And you just glossed over it. You didn't speak to it because I think there's so much resident in that I would want you to ventilate. And then another one is right now, if you see the entire discourse about climate change is in the midst of less than 0.5% of the world population, the very elitists like you and the people in this room. Now, you and I know that those people who are truly, who truly, the bulk of the world don't understand you. And if there's no how do I put it, critical mass for whatsoever you are driving, the problem is you might not have the traction that you need. What are experts like you doing to ensure that the dialogue and the discourse is broken down in such a way that people can understand it as they understand when fuel, the cost of fuel is increased? Stuff like that. We need to bring the dialogue down to people so that we can now have the kind of traction. That's my observation. And the other one, like I said, is I would want you to speak to complete communities so that we can begin to move from there. Thank you so very much. Other things I think you have dealt with as you were answering to other people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the audience. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I think in the interest of time, so complete communities is basically this, what we call built environment. And I'll be honest with you, it's also one of the biggest space for opportunities in our country that we haven't taken advantage of. Because we need to build our houses differently in order to be able to withstand flooding at the very minimum. That's the adaptation side of it. And that's why it was in the middle. But also, our buildings can also be green to the point that they contribute to mitigation in terms of our design system, in terms of, including solar panel together. And some of them we're doing them. And I'm wondering, how can we then aggregate all of those on a large scale, state level, we quantify them and say this is the amount of emissions against business as usual, and you sell that as credit. It will interest you to know that the Chicago Carbon Exchange Program has got a lot of people being paid for just having green roofs and having those spaces. You don't do it as an individual level. You need a critical mass of people, like I said, but that critical mass needs to be matched with critical acts, critical actions, and you combine critical actions together. How do you get people to be involved? Create opportunities for them. The moment there is a sense that when you build your house this way, over a period of time, you get revenue, it just changes the whole calibration. The whole discussions. And I think it's very important so that the new set of houses we're building should be green and over a large scale, with a large population involved, you can do significant accounting. And Dr. Segun Adaju, to your earlier question, we must not look at things at the individual level. There's power in aggregation. If we have to be able to talk about something that is going to be significant enough, so it's not for one solar project. It has to be multiple of them within a certain and defined jurisdiction. And that is when the cost of the third-party verification becomes cheaper because you're doing it to scale. They're not going to, it's the same methodology, but you can't generate a lot with small group. So that is where, that's what we're calling complete communities. But look, the leadership that we talked about transcends beyond state entities. We must find a way to sell the message. But when we sell the opportunities, and people can say, today, close to 100,000 farmers in India and Kenya get paid for what we call carbon soils. They are planting, they just follow a political protocol. And we're using area survey to account before and after, and you stick with it, and you get paid for carbon soils. It is not rocket science. It's the same thing my grandparents did with farming, munching, bunching, following and everything. But you aggregate it, 100,000 farmers. We've got millions of farmers in Nigeria. So it's very important for few people to lead by understanding this and be able to aggregate opportunities for people. When you farm this way, you still have increased yield, but in addition, by maintaining the quality of soil to this certain level, you get additional payment for that. That is already happening in Kenya. In fact, 15% of all credits from Africa supplied to the carbon market comes from Kenya alone. And guess what? It's led by only 17 developers. So 15% of a $2 billion is just managed by 17 project developers. And we have 100 project developers that are dealing with thousands of people. And that, by the time there is an incentive, the power of incentive is your best chance of changing behavior. It's the same, the way our parents say, Tobashile, Ma Wagbaile. And the same principle says this, that if you do this, you get this. This is awaiting you. And that is it. And the same way, because we can't keep doing everything by sanction. We're going to beat you if you don't do it. No, it is do this and you can get this. And that is the world order when it comes to finance. And we need to be able to get a lot of people. Start with one state, aggregate the farmers, tell them this, we can follow this protocol. And you're still going to get increase per unit hectare, but by following this particular practice, you also get paid for the carbon soils. And I think those possibilities are there. We just need to find a way to engage them. And I do understand it's not very easy, and I understand because we're focused on profitability. Carbon is not a burden on us. Carbon is an opportunity to diversify our income streams. And the moment we frame it that way, we kind of will embrace it differently. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Oh, my apologies. I think I got logged out. I apologize. I think, thank you, Dr. Somorin. I didn't hear the last bit of what you said, but I think it's time over now. I want to apologize to everyone for stretching beyond the time limit. And at this point, I would want to hand over to Professor Anibugu. And before I do that, I think it's a conversation that will be continuous. I think we need to come back to talk about how the real application, how can we apply, how can every one of us benefit? I mean, open disclosure, for example. I'm a consultant with the African Development Bank, supporting Lagos State government to develop its decentralized renewable energy. I'm working with Elizabeth in Kenya, I'm sure you know. Like so how can, I mean, all the experts here, how can we also plug into this space and add value? So at this point, I would like to hand over to Professor Anibugu. Please, my prof, my apologies, I stretched beyond the time allotted. Over to you, sir.
Well, Dr. Finshaw, thank you so much. I wish we could extend this discussion for another hour. It's very loaded, very stimulating. And in fact, you have given us lots of ideas, even how to structure some of the proposals that's on our table. I want to thank Engineer Shehu for this connection. We are more than glad to welcome you as a member of the family. I think it will interest you to know that Professor Kevin Orama, your colleague, is already a member of this community. Kevin is a personal friend. And so not just that, even the president himself is also a good friend. When he was in Kenya, I can see you're taking their footsteps. Prof started in Kenya. Kevin was in Kenya. I met both of them in Kenya. So maybe the next for you is a ministerial position in Nigeria. And then finally an intern. I don't know. But let me just say we are so delighted to have you. And I, in particular, am so proud of you. Your level of growth, maturity, and the future that you have ahead of you, we will pray that God will make sure it brings you there. So welcome to the INT family. You will surely come back. You will surely come back. Eh?
Thank you very much.
It was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. So Mr. Shehu, make sure he comes back. And on that note, I want to thank everybody. Dr. Adaju, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. And I especially want to appreciate Professor Fakai. Professor Fakai, do you just say a quick hello? Because I know you were thoroughly, please don't share your the announcements yet. Where's Professor Fakai? I want him to at least say hello. I know he was thoroughly blessed tonight. Can you spotlight him, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Somorin. Thank you very much. I'm chairing a talk. Yes, I'm chairing a talk next week. A group is bringing up some group of people together to talk about climate change next Monday. So this year talk has really, provided a lot of things for me, as I chair that. And I want to thank Professor Anibugu for what he's been doing. I didn't know we would come to this point, Prof. Look at the type of people you are gathering and putting together to make this institute something else. God bless you and thank you again, moderator. You did a fantastic work tonight. We are getting better every day. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, Prof, for always joining us. I don't know how you find the time. Dr. Finshaw, it will interest you to know that Professor Fakai was the former Vice Chancellor of University of Science and Technology in River State. Wow. So thank you so much. So you are joining a very interesting group and we are looking forward to adopting you. So, okay, on that note, Shehu, please take over. You're the one that started this, so finish it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you much. I would like to apologize to everyone. Stay 10 minutes over. I would like to keep it that way. Just one more announcement is in 2023 International Conference is in October in Uyo, Akwa Ibom State in Nigeria. The right topic around agripreneurship, and I see a lot of tying into the climate part of the discussion into this conference as the key to African development. And of course, we're trying to, we're building a partnership with AFDB in hosting this as well as many other international resources. So on this note, we want to appreciate everyone. The recording link will be posted after. Can go over this again, and of course we want to deepen the discussion and take action until it translates to action. We haven't got anything from this discourse, and thank you very much, my very good friend Dr. Olufunso, for coming and for sharing. This up past midnight already in Nairobi, and you have kept up, and I know it's an area of passion for you, so it's a very easy one. So on this note, I will ask Prof. Fakai to give us a closing prayer, and we close on that note. Thank you, sir.
And let him pray for Dr. Funsho too, please.
Okay.
We pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you. Tonight, we started, we ask that you may see us through. We've passed through, we've heard a lot about what is before us and the things we need to do. I pray, Father, Lord, that this discussion tonight may not just stop here. Help us as an institute and people you have put together to play our own part in what we should do about climate change. I want to pray, Father, Lord, for our brother, Dr. Somorin. I'm praying, Father, Lord, some pronouncement has been made on this platform that he will not just be featured here today, but even what has been said, let it be prophetic, that it will be found useful even on higher platforms, for we pray in Jesus' name. Our Heavenly Father, we do pray, oh God, the Lord, you continue to help our continent, Africa, that we will not continue to remain as a suffering part of the globe, but Lord, we will come up to see ourselves better in the days ahead, for we pray in Jesus' name. Help our institute, oh God, that will continue to make the difference that we need to see in our nation and in our continent. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much,
everyone. Thank you, Dr. Funsho.
Thank you, everyone. God bless you. Good night. And please, if you're ever in Nairobi, your brother is here.
Oh,
we have Nigerian restaurants here too.
As long as you can have